A scream that makes birds fly away echoes through a mansion, urging someone to calm down. On the floor, valuable dishes were broken, and a drink was spilling as the voice gently said that everything was okay. A woman with light hair gesticulates nervously with her hand, saying this was not a battlefield. But the large man in front of her still pinned her against the wall after causing cracks in every corner. He stared at her with pure fury in his eyes, making her realize that her attempts to calm him were useless. For her, who faced him every day in that large mansion, it was a war with that mad dog who always lost control, so she used one of her hands to make a glow appear. The glow slowly spread over the man's body as they stared at each other in silence until he seemed to calm down, finally fainting in her arms, exhausted from all the chaos. With a sigh, she stopped the raging dog that was going crazy today too. She sarcastically congratulates herself for stopping him 10 seconds faster than the last time. Then, she asks the man to step away from her, even though he remains silent with his head on her shoulder. When he doesn't, the girl pushes him away anyway, annoyed. And so she realizes that drama was about to start again. Now he was looking at her like an abandoned puppy instead of angrily. The truth was that this big dog never told her what he really wanted, so she asks what it was this time. After a moment, he begins to speak beside her, touching one of the girl's hands, asking her to stay by his side when he pulls her closer. He never told her anything until she asked directly to understand. Even though he wanted her to stay by his side, the girl couldn't even hug him properly. If it continued like this, she couldn't even imagine when her debut in society would be, making her sigh in exhaustion, responding that she would stay, which made him hug her quickly, despite her unhappy expression. She started her day with the feeling of wanting to retire and wonders how her life ended up this way. All her problems began when she received a specific mission. In the cathedral of a large church, where a man with silver hair and a gentle face asks that God's blessings be with her. The protagonist responded with a tense expression, saying it was a pleasure to see the cardinal, who was the highest authority of the temple she belonged to. The position in the Rakian temple is simple and severe, with the high priest, one of the 7 sons of God, then the cardinal, in charge of each temple, and the bishops who supervise. Finally, there was the lowest system, a common priestess, which was what our protagonist was. When she was innocent and knew nothing about the world, she was very happy for the great honor of going to the temple. As her career grew, she spent her days struggling with what she thought was her own problem. It's been 7 years since she has been working like a slave without her parents to support her. Called by the cardinal, our protagonist, the priestess Dialin, because it had been a while since they spent time together and followed God's teachings. It was a lot for her, and at the same time, it wasn't. But the truth was that Dialin could feel something bad coming. The cardinal says with a smile that she overcame difficulties and became a wonderful person. It was like buying a fake lottery ticket to win something suddenly. The cardinal, an elder, asks them to accept a job as if it were a great honor, making her have the feeling that something wouldn't end well. Still, Dialin responds pretending to be happy, asking how she could help the cardinal. She had no luck, only got difficult jobs, and even achieving results, she couldn't expect any promotion. In the beginning, she hated, refused, and tried to resist all of this. There were moments when she threw herself into the pit of frustration, only to realize that it was better to just accept and obey. The cardinal responds that as expected of a professional priestess, she was quick and useful. Dialin wonders what kind of horrible job he was planning to give her this time, still pretending sympathy with a fake smile. Then the elder tells her that her job would be to help people suffering from the aftermath of the war to adapt to society again. This completely shattered her already low expectations. Mentally, Dialin screams in frustration because it was impossible to do. She was just a priestess and knew nothing about wars or beasts and blood. Still, she remains unshaken when the cardinal asks if she was used to this because she had been on the battlefield twice in her life. Dialin wasn't very convinced of this, and the cardinal laughs, replying that these people need God's help more than anyone. Only those who went through it knew how easily war could break people's hearts. The priests sent to heal the wounded minds and bodies of soldiers returning from war. But they only provide treatment so they can return to the battlefield. Being able to return to daily life without problems is another story. A temple ceases to be a service organization when its origin or support wields such power. Now that there is a shortage of people, sending an experienced priest indicates a serious situation. Moreover, their status is equal to or higher than that of the high nobility. Dylan says that now she is the one who most needs the help of the gods in her life, thinking that if she just accepts that job without any support, she would simply die silently. The cardinal says it's their job to help those in need, and the protagonist mentions what would happen if she lost her life. And the elder cheerfully responds that she would find eternal peace in the arms of God, not caring at all about what would happen to her. This made Dylan want to curse the cardinal with 30 different names, as 7 years ago, she would have obeyed that order without hesitation. She knew she had no choice but to do what was commanded, but still, she asks if it wasn't a different situation where she could die. The truth was that she was super frustrated, wanting to know what the benefit was for her to make such a decision. No matter how rational the conditions are, it was a matter of accepting or not. Even if she accepts honestly, she would be made a fool. This posture makes the cardinal cross his fingers in front of his face and think a little. The protagonist thinks that if she runs away, certainly the elder would be in trouble now, but to risk her life, they needed to offer a realistic reward for it. Still, all the cardinal says is that she should obey in silence, forcing the same sympathetic smile. Despite the intense exchange of false glances, Dylan wanted to withdraw if she didn't like any order. By general norms, priests were forbidden from receiving personal money, so no matter how much she worked, there was never any money in the priestess's pocket. Even knowing this, and seeing that money going away and being wasted, she never cared about it. Since she was raised in a temple, she thought it was normal for these things to happen, grateful to have a warm bed and not worry about anything but to strive innocently. But after being sent to the battlefield and facing death several times, her way of thinking changed drastically. No matter how long she lived, fighting and dying insignificantly, there was no one capable of understanding her efforts. Born alone and died alone, that was life, which is why Dylan decided not to be naive anymore. If the cardinal would force her back to the battlefield, no matter what, she would resign her job right there. Until after a long time, the elder sighs, saying that for a long time, he saw how competent she was, which is why he was aware of it. It was also regrettable that she hadn't been recognized by the temple until now, which excited the protagonist for the potential promotion. The elder states that if she resolves this matter without problems, both the temple and the high priests will recognize her. Dylan gets excited about the probability and the prospect of a future promotion. If everything goes well, she would have a higher position in the temple, which makes her smile even more. With these conditions, she would accept the job with good taste. So, the protagonist responds that if that was his wish, her mission was to go to that place according to the voice of God. Then, as requested, she would proceed to fulfill her tasks and asks whom she should help. With that, the cardinal snaps his fingers, knowing that the priestess would say exactly that, and orders them to follow the instructions and take her right away, which surprises Dylan when two people with fake smiles grab her by the shoulders. Finally, the elder reveals that the person who needs help was the winner of the war, the warrior of the 8th Berserk Division. Dylan still didn't understand the problem in that, even being carried by the arms, and asks if he was referring to cruel people who kill indiscriminately. To which the cardinal gives a dark smile, agreeing that she was in charge of one of them now. Drawing a look of despair from the protagonist, the elder tells Dylan to prepare to leave soon, wishing her good luck, hoping she returns safe and sound, which drives the protagonist crazy and leaves her trembling in fear. Now that she thought about it, the cardinal was always talking with his eyes. And despite her cries to resign under the smiles pretending innocence, deep down, it was Dylan who continued to be naive with those temple people. And so, without realizing it, that day, she was sent to that mansion, where she had to take care of a huge, uncontrollable man who covered his ears and curled up in the corner. But the glow in his eyes was purely murderous, making Dylan realize she was involved in a very difficult problem to solve. Our protagonist made her journey to meet her client that time in a carriage passing through a forest. In the end, she had just returned from the battlefield and was already being dragged back to hell, making her cover her face with her hands. She adjusts her sitting posture on the bench, thinking she had been through this before, so she couldn't even shed tears anymore, even wanting to cry. We are introduced to Unit 8, to which the person Dylan would be responsible for belonged. In the war between Recklian and the neighboring country Solven, Solven always had the upper hand during battles. The morale of Raklian's army continued to decline with each defeat, and no one could expect a victory. They fought a losing battle with no chance of a turning point. Then those people suddenly appeared. A small group of elite people whose origins were not very clear. It was as if they were possessed with their movements and superhuman strength. They appeared, and when the battle ended, they disappeared, simply bringing victory to Raklian. Allies called them saviors, and their enemies, true bloody demons. Dylan was very grateful to the saviors for appearing and hoped this unpleasant war would end quickly thanks to them. Even if the winners weren't from the country of Raklian, she prayed for everything to go well in her childish innocence. Those who were the saviors were soon called savages because they did not distinguish friends from enemies when attacking. She heard the voices of various people begging for help and several wounded scattered on the battlefield. Of course, just being violent beasts, skilled only in fighting and taking lives, that would happen. But thanks to them, they won the war in a short period. The second prince led the war and reached stardom. However, due to the rampant violence in Unit 8, they were buried in obscurity, and their achievements were attributed to the second prince. Now that the war was over, the unit disappeared completely, so even Dylan forgot about them. Although they were beasts, they were also the great heroes who brought true victory. Thus, the royalty said it was more appropriate to grant them lands and titles instead of hiding them, ordering them to be treated and trained to be worthy of nobility. Such was the order given to the temple. The protagonist trembles at the thought of how many nights it took to stop one person from that group, and certainly couldn't do anything like that alone. Anyway, the temple still intended to pay her, so she had to fulfill her task. The elder sending a jewel with a fake smile that in the name of God, nothing was impossible, was a somewhat ridiculous sight. Not only did Dylan have to make him human, but also transform this person into a noble. While sadly reflecting on her life, the name of the priestess was called by a man traveling with her in the carriage. He smiles and says they were about to arrive, and thanks her again for accepting that request. The protagonist returns the smile when she realizes she had completely forgotten she was accompanied, responding that she only followed God's will. This guy was Rovin Tarak, the strategist of Raklian's army and the third son of the Tarak family, a person with an easy smile. He was competent, but after the war, he received a less important position to clean up the mess left by Unit 8. Rovin smiles, saying that even if she follows God's will, it was a very difficult decision for a human to make, especially considering that her client was from the 8th unit. But despite his nervous and worried air, Dylan promises to do her best. He thanks her again, as the only person he could trust now was the priestess, then puts his hand inside his coat, taking out an object and offering it to her in his hand, asking her to always keep it close from now on. Dylan takes it and asks what kind of whistle it was, and Rovin gestures that it was a safety device to be used in case of emergencies. It was created to calm the agitation of those guys from Unit 8, which made the protagonist understand how the situation was handled now. She was curious about how they controlled them, but never imagined they had developed that type of training, so she puts the whistle around her neck while thanking Rovin. Until he looks back, outside the carriage, noticing that they had arrived at their destination. This was the grand mansion where the person Dylan was going to stay was, and where the person they would care for was. They explained that there is a service team in the mansion, but now they were at home, so cleaning and laundry were done only once a week. Meals were served every 2 days in the morning, and the mansion guards were always on duty, so Dylan could only call them if necessary. The protagonist faces the guards, becoming tense with Rovin's explanations, and he says that the guards would take care of the corpses or become one of them, but she could always use a whistle. This didn't make Dylan feel any more relieved, and she says that if possible, she would like to be at home and come only when necessary. Which brings a smile to Rovin as he returns to the carriage, saying it was impossible, and leaving with the most brazen attitude in the world. After being abandoned in that new house with an impossible mission, the guards approach to help her with the luggage, despite Dylan feeling that life was sad. She responds that she could handle the luggage alone, but the guards still help her by opening the door for her to enter. They guide her, telling her that her room is at the back, and ask her to stay safe in there. When the protagonist enters the house, she remains silent and observes her surroundings. Inside a huge, chic, and illuminated hall, she questions if there was anyone around. Dylan entered expecting to be attacked by a beast as soon as she stepped inside, but there wasn't even a sign of life as she walked around. Still, she notices some things inside that mansion. The more she saw, full of glimmers and golden decorations, she finally finds the place she wanted after passing through a door, opening a smile. Realizing how luxurious the house was, from the corridors to the rooms, everything was a great work of art to her eyes. Until now, Dylan had been living in a small room with a bed that looked like a coffin, making her feel relieved at least to have a place to sleep. At first, she thought it would be like a kennel inside because of the rabid dog, but if the kennel was this luxurious, she would be more than happy to enter. Dylan raises her voice to say that she was there, happy as she walked through the mansion with her luggage in hand. She dances and jumps through the corridors of the mansion, not wanting to let anyone get in her way. Everything was very bright, and she couldn't even look directly at anything in that place, which only made her happier to open the doors and explore the house. Until she enters a room where a large man with a dark aura was crouched in a corner. This same man looks over his shoulder in Dylan's direction with a murderous and threatening air, which completely broke her previous happiness. The protagonist faces that man who started to rise, trying to calm down, as dealing with a beast, she couldn't afford to lose her patience. Nervously, she holds a whistle, trying to greet the man and wish him God's blessing. But he twists his features in anger, staring at her while roaring like a true beast, which made Dylan tense, as it seemed her situation had changed drastically from one moment to the next. She tries to take a step forward and realizes there were glass shards and broken pieces of wood under her feet. Dylan couldn't assess how much rationality was left in that man, but if that muscular body hit her, it would be instant death without a doubt. The two just stare at each other in a tense and uncomfortable silence. And the protagonist notices that the growling at least ceased, making her wonder if he was calming down. So she decides she might try to start a conversation first to confirm how much they could communicate. Dylan opens her mouth to say that she was a priestess, which makes the man leap at her in an instant. She raises the whistle with a terrified expression on her face, realizing she was completely wrong. Despite being a rabid dog, he was still a human being after all. And so she blows the whistle so loud that even the birds fly away. Therefore, she hoped he could at least find a way to communicate with Dylan as a human. When the protagonist blows the whistle, a great glow appears around the man's neck like a collar to restrain him. She kept blowing when his body collapsed to the side, no longer falling on top of her, making a loud sound that makes the protagonist nervously open her eyes. Before her, the man fell to the floor, no longer seeming like a threat, despite the scene leaving her confused. Dylan realizes he was unconscious and looks in shock at the whistle, wondering what happened and how the sound reacted to him. She crouches down, worried when she notices he was no longer breathing and the possibility of having killed him, touching him to see if he reacted. But she quickly jumps away and runs to the door, wondering what she was thinking staying next to someone who had just tried to take her life. Despite a long moment of silence in the room, Dylan realizes the man didn't seem to want to get up anytime soon. Then she slowly approaches again with cautious steps, carefully trying to check the man's body, verifying if he had really lost his life. She tries calling the mad dog, wondering if he was pretending to be dead just to gain an advantage over her. Dylan pokes him, even liking the idea that he had lost his life so she could abandon the job, but at the same time, she worries about having taken a life this way. Until something catches her attention and she wonders what it is. There were strangulation marks on his neck that he didn't have a while ago, making her consider that it was because of the whistle, which terrifies her as it could be a way to take his life without emitting sounds of pain. Despite her not feeling anything unusual with the whistle, they looked like strangulation marks, and now the body seemed like a corpse that scared her, so she hides the whistle in her clothes, realizing she should use it as little as possible. The protagonist turns him to lie on his back and notices an improvement, surprised because his body was too heavy. She wonders if due to his muscles, his head ended up like that, which was hard to believe. Hurriedly, she grabs a pillow from the room and places it under the man's head, not wanting to leave him uncomfortable either. Realizing she had to do physical work too, Dylan gets frustrated with the kind of job she got into. Then noticing that he was snoring, she decides to let him wake up. Wondering what she should do about the wound on his neck, which seemed quite recent, Dylan curls up and covers her head, wondering why she couldn't just stay with grateful and easy to deal with people. She suddenly stands up from the floor, sitting on the body to try to do something useful, starting by asking how she should call him, maybe crime weapon or something like that when his body was full of scars. this would be just a special treatment as an apology for what she did earlier, asking him not to tell anyone as she places her hands on his chest. A strong light emerges from her hands, and Dialin hopes it's nothing exaggerated when it was a service based on the patient's capacity. She knew since she was a child that her powers were extraordinary. But even being so young, she wouldn't have support, and as she showed her special abilities, people would take advantage of it, so she kept it a secret. For a common priest, healing these wounds would take at least half a day, but thanks to Dialin, now he would only have a wonderful body without scars. She says she worked so hard that her body needs sugar, so it would be nice to have a luxurious meal in that house to regain her energy. Which makes her wonder how that dog survives, as he probably shouldn't just eat raw meat even being a beast. At least his face looked more suitable while he was asleep. Suddenly, he opens his eyes furiously while the protagonist is distracted, and the two find themselves in a very awkward situation again. The guy sits up quickly, and his head hits Dialin's, making her fall backward with blood coming from her nose. A little later, with her nostrils covered to stop the bleeding and an irritated expression, she faces the man before her, shouting that she didn't do anything strange to his body and was just treating him, even though he curls up and covers himself like a little girl. He averts his gaze, making a dramatic scene that leaves her irritated, shouting for him to stop acting like he lost something when nothing happened. Dialin at least felt relieved that his sense of reason had returned to the point of him being embarrassed, but still, she felt like crying. Still, she approaches because she hadn't finished the treatment, saying for him to calm down as she wouldn't do anything bad. When Dialin begins to use her healing powers, he widens his eyes in surprise before calming down. To which she asks if he wasn't feeling better now with a smile, probably because he was anxious the first time. Apparently the members of the 8th Division have better senses than creatures, and that's why his reaction must have been like that. Most things can be calmed by divine power. God was everywhere, which makes her celebrate the existence of divine power. Dialin asks if he feels more comfortable now, and he nods, finally responding with a yes. This surprises her because suddenly he became docile, which was worthy of praise. So, she asks what his name is, and he responds that his name is Cares. The protagonist compliments Kara's name and asks who gave him that name, to which he responds he doesn't know, worrying her as she couldn't continue the conversation. So she inquires if he tends to get emotional a lot, but this makes Karis tilt his head in confusion, and Dialin realizes it was too difficult for him to understand. This made her worried about how far she could take that conversation while treating him. Then Karis stared at her with a frightening aura, making her think that if it grew worse, she wouldn't be safe. She decides that for today, that short conversation was enough, not wanting to provoke him, so Dialin mentions being hungry and nervously tries to change the subject. She stands up and says that to avoid her stomach making noise, she would come back later after eating, smiling tensely. Still, she tries to invite Cares to have lunch with her, offering to bring food for him, and he agrees immediately. This makes her realize it must be difficult for Cares to communicate normally unless with yes or no questions, so Dialin tells him to wait on the couch until the food arrives. To her surprise, he gets up and obediently goes to sit on the couch, seeming like a dog that listens to commands. Dialin wonders if this was an unexpected victory on her side, hoping he wouldn't attack her again, imagining that he wouldn't do anything as long as he wasn't provoked. She leaves the room and smiles upon seeing the food prepared, as it looked delicious and Cares would be surprised. Thus, Dialin quickens her pace to see what had been prepared because it smelled very good. At that moment, the protagonist still didn't know something unimaginable awaited her. Elsewhere, while having tea, a blonde-haired girl says that the priestess hasn't arrived yet, but she smiles, thinking she might meet this person soon. She asks another person named Savian if he is also excited about the priestess's arrival, and Savian agrees with his mother. The woman looks out the window, wondering what the hero of the 8th Division would look like. Meanwhile, Dialin was facing a terrifying scene of Karis trying to eat and bleeding heavily after breaking the food plate. The blonde-haired woman believes that Karis looks great now. In parallel, during her meal with Karis, the protagonist jumps towards him in concern when she sees him vomiting blood, trying to detoxify him somehow. She extends her hands to his blood-covered chest, asking him to hold on a little longer as he would soon feel better after she uses her powers. Then something catches her attention in the midst of the healing process, and a sigh escapes her lips as she realizes it was nothing but very red juice, not real blood. Asking nervously if he choked because he was in a hurry to eat, to the point of splattering juice all over the room and the dishes, making her wonder if he was that hungry. Dylan takes a deep breath, wondering what she was doing, and says she was surprised by the sudden shout, apologizing to him for the mess, until she belatedly realizes that Keris was staring at her with a murderous aura, making her tense. One of his juice-covered hands rests on her shoulder, and Dylan thinks this could be her true end. She prays for God to at least tell her this before dying, pleading to her merciful God. When one dies, she wished at least to receive a retirement allowance. If she could end up with money to buy a house, she would accept death willingly. Then Keris starts speaking to the protagonist, who was still nervous and awaiting her final end. Wiping his face with the back of his hand, he says that all the food is poisoned, still staring at her with the murderous aura. Fortunately, at least Keris didn't seem to be affected by the poison even after eating. Dylan asks if he was really okay and how he knew the food was poisoned, which makes him fall silent with crossed arms. The real problem was that although he ate before her, she still ended up surviving. She herself had no resistance to poison, so if she had eaten, she certainly would have died instantly. This makes her stand up, asking if there was nothing she could eat, and Keris agrees that there is nothing edible, which worries her as Dylan hadn't eaten anything since morning. Worrying that she might die of hunger, eat poison and die, or lose her life to a hungry beast. So many options made it difficult to make a decision. With a sigh, Dylan couldn't believe she could play with fire this way. But the only thing she could do now was that, so she tells Keris that she could leave it in his hands, which confuses him. It was her moment to shine and demonstrate what she was capable of, leaving Dylan burning with determination. She runs out of the room, asking him to wait a little, leaving Keris still not understanding anything there. He could only hear Dylan's voice echoing through the mansion, reaffirming that she could indeed do it and that she would do her best. In the kitchen, she was beginning to prepare something to eat with her own hands despite her determination, hoping that they hadn't poisoned the potatoes or the carrots and the flour too, to make her life a little less complicated. Then the guard approaches and asks if what he brought to the kitchen was enough because they didn't have spices, and the protagonist affirms to work with what they have on hand. He also says that he informed Lord Rovan, who should appear immediately, which gets a thank you from Dylan, before returning her focus to the table, questioning if she could really cook like this. When was the last time she cooked? Before entering the temple, she remembered helping a bit with household chores. She knew how to wash vegetables and that it was necessary to keep stirring the soup, at least basic things she could do. But she never thought she would need to use her experience of growing up in a poor family, deciding to cook clumsily with her limited knowledge. Although her skill wasn't the best, she hoped they would appreciate the soup she prepared, which brought pure fear to those vegetables threatened by Dylan's cooking. With a knife in hand, the protagonist prepares to destroy the poor vegetables with a smile on her face, to the point that even several birds flew away desperately after all the commotion. Time passes until sunset, while a carriage is still outside the house. Footsteps approach quickly through the house of someone running, and this someone bursts into the kitchen where Dylan still was, asking what happened. It was Rovan, desperately asking if Keris killed someone or if they were in critical condition, or perhaps escaped from the mansion. To which Dylan quickly signals for silence with her index finger to Rovan, saying to stay calm because he was a bit irritated because he hadn't eaten yet. The protagonist is surprised because Rovan arrived quickly even in an emergency, thinking he would take at least 3 days, a criticism that caught him off guard. She sighs and says that if that were the case, she would have fled before calling Rovan, but there was something she still wanted to discuss with him. Then she hurries back to the kitchen, realizing something was cooking, leaving the Lord confused behind. He follows her into the kitchen to peek at what she was preparing, and asks if she was cursing someone as a hobby when there was a dead creature on her plate, but Dylan cheerfully says this was dinner. Rovan lies, mentioning it looks like a simple and beautiful meal for dinner, which pleases the protagonist because it was better than something poisoned for Keris. This caught him off guard, not understanding anything with a fake smile on his face. She says she made a meal with the ingredients there and gave a warning about it. A few hours ago, the time it took to make the soup was too long, and she worried that Keras might have become violent again during that period. It was a miracle he had remained calm until now, so Dylan returns to Keras's room and peeks through the door, announcing she arrived with dinner, apologizing because she made what she could for a soup without knowing if it was to his liking, and smiles, carrying the food into the room. She finds him standing near the window with crossed arms, seeming to wait patiently. The two stare at each other, and Dylan realizes he was indeed a noble despite being a beast inside, having a certain elegance despite not understanding why he was holding a candelabrum. If he could control his impulsive actions, he could debut as a noble soon, but suddenly Keras turns with a candelabrum in hand towards the window, and perfectly visualizes a bird on a tree outside, ready to hunt it like a true beast, shooting the candelabrum and killing the bird like a hunter through the window. Her vision of a noble was completely shattered with that scene, and the protagonist could only watch in shock. Returning to the present, she thought she would have to do it again because Keras craved meat, and Rovan agrees that it seemed the best thing to do. And if it continues like this, he would eventually become a noble, despite Rovan's soulless lie being clear as day, eager to see his debut in society. He jokes that his soul was enjoying its vacation, and he was the type who wants a balance between work and personal life. The protagonist covers the dead bird with the chopped vegetables and replies that when his soul returns, he should let her know, which makes him say everything is fine and there is no need to worry, as what she has achieved so far is admirable, having great expectations for the priestess. With that, even if Charlotte appears, there should be no problems, which surprises the protagonist. And she stares at Rovan without understanding anything until he pretends not to understand, because Rovan shouldn't have mentioned it before, smiling as he reveals that the imperial family would come, and Princess Charlotte with the third prince, Savian, would be attending the mansion. Both were very interested in Keras, news that left Dylan so terrified that she almost dropped the dinner. Her life was falling into an abyss now. Charlotte, the princess with golden hair and a pink dress, was an elegant girl from the royal family. The current emperor of Rakian had two empresses. When the first one passed away, the emperor took his mistress, Fenelia, as the next empress. However, his love for Fenelia was short-lived, and the emperor quickly began searching for another woman. Among them was Charlotte, who was a beautiful woman with golden hair and a sweet smile. The emperor loved her so much even while with Fenelia that people started calling Charlotte the 3-day empress. It was a well-known fact that the emperor's love was directed towards Charlotte and her son Savian, and now both were about to meet the mad dog at the mansion. The protagonist could imagine the scene of Charlotte and Savian conversing with the awkward and bloodied Keras as a horror movie scene, where later, Keras would reveal his murderous personality, making her stop imagining the scene immediately. Dylan screams that true chaos would happen, as it was possible someone could die just by looking into his eyes. It should be impossible for such a meeting to happen, somberly stating it was impossible, and she would probably be condemned to death for destroying the royal family using Keras as a beast, until Rovan smiles, asking her to calm down as they were important people to the emperor, and he was confident they would take precautions to make everything work out. The protagonist insists that she worries about these people as she didn't know what would happen, making her sigh in nervousness. Keras says that if there were a small accident, he could handle it calmly, and smiles immediately. But he thought an accident would occur right there with that dinner she was making, and even Dylan is surprised by the soup about to explode. Keras is shocked because she really intended to offer that for Keras to eat, and she says that even if it wasn't well made, it was better than risking being poisoned. Mentioning this makes Rovan avert his gaze, saying it was common and happened several times, which caught Dylan off guard and irritated her, as it shouldn't be commonplace. He says they sent carefully selected fresh vegetables, which shouldn't contain poison originally, were made with so much love by the farmers. Although Dylan's dinner dish was so cursed that it made scary sounds and had a frightening face. Then, Rovan asks if the soup is ready to be served, even if it seemed there was a demon in the pot, ready to be thrown away, to Dylan's despair, who begs not to do that or Keras wouldn't have dinner. Still, he shouts that he wouldn't stop as he preferred to poison him rather than that horrendous thing in the pot, and the protagonist hugs him desperately to prevent him from throwing away the food. He even starts crying that there are many foods that are terrifying just to look at, and there is no need to eat them to know if they're good. which makes Dylan cry too, as she hadn't eaten anything herself, and he suggests it would be healthier to eat raw potatoes instead of that monstrosity. Rowan recalls that she was roasting a chicken before and notices that even it turned into a horrendous demon, impressing him because divine power seemed to create life too. Anyway, he says he will deliver new ingredients with a recipe book, which makes Dylan agree to throw that away, despite their argument. Until suddenly, both are shocked when Keras bursts open the kitchen door, emanating that murderous aura from before. He stares at them, seeming ready to take someone's life just with a look, demanding that they pass him that demon pot immediately, despite Dylan and Rowan being super tense, and they have no choice but to comply. So, they place the food back on a plate, despite its scary and demonic appearance. And Keras stares at that plate with the same frightening expression, grabbing the food with his own hand, and with a violence that dissolves the demon's face instantly, swallowing the food immediately as if it were a slime that disintegrated, leaving both Rowan and Dylan totally in shock with the vision of pure hell, watching him chew that. After a moment, the protagonist nervously asks what he thought of the taste. Waiting for him to finish chewing, he extends his hand towards her and says he wants more, surprising her. Despite the confusion, Dylan agrees and asks him to wait a moment under Rowan's surprised look, which makes him think that the priestess was indeed under divine protection to be so close to a beast so naturally. Rowan tells Keras that he heard the food was poisoned, asking what kind of poison it was, and he responds that it was hemlock and hydrocyanic acid. Dylan asks if he could identify the poisons so well, and Rowan says that the members of the 8th Division receive this type of training and resistance to intoxication. This impresses her because his senses in general were as sensitive as those of an animal, and she wonders if it was also part of the training. And Rowan says it was the result of training children who already had remarkable qualities in their bodies, senses, and nervous systems, with rumors that even magic was used. The temple controls all invisible powers, calling them sacred powers. Unless the person was a combat priest, sacred power was supposed to be used only to save people. Using magic to turn children into human weapons left Dylan surprised, and she asks if the temple is involved. This makes Rowan fall silent for a moment, staring at the protagonist. Then he smiles and asks if it even matters. While she was distracted, Keras took the pot from Dylan's hands and pulled it close. Finally, she says it doesn't matter and that it has always been this way and always will be. Even if an unknown group is abusing magic, it's not her concern. After all, Dylan was just an ordinary priestess, and her duty was to fulfill her tasks. This makes Rowan say that there are no records of the children who were raised as members of the 8th Division. It was extremely difficult to find such information. Still, there are many ways to make something that doesn't exist. The comment makes Dylan's mind start working about the records of the lost children, and Rowan concludes with a smile, saying he hopes everything goes well. This makes the protagonist hug herself tense, agreeing with him and saying she would achieve the best results despite her lack of confidence. She wasn't there to say she couldn't do it, but to actually do it, and a little later Rowan leaves the mansion. The protagonist watches him leave during the night from the window and thinks it was indeed a long day, crossing her arms. She saw Keras eat normally and decided to taste her own food, but it was almost like poison to her stomach that only Keras could eat. Dylan was so surprised that she left Rowan and Keras behind and ran far away, saying to take his time because she was going to rest. In the end, she threw herself on the bed to rest and thinks that was the only good thing about that house. She believed Keras ate and went to sleep too, but it was impressive that he didn't make any noise, and time passed peacefully. In any case, she hopes they don't kill him, and instead of worrying about others, she decides to sleep right away. So, Dylan curls up very happily under the covers, realizing it was the best mattress she had used, and that even bad things had their good side. She couldn't eat well, but at least she could have a good night's sleep, which made Dylan happy. She hoped to sleep until noon, without realizing that Rowan was literally standing next to her with that murderous aura, until she sits up suddenly, surprised, noticing him standing there with that threatening look. Realizing something was wrong, the protagonist quickly pulls the whistle out of her clothes, ready to defend herself. His face contorts even more, seeing this defensive posture. and his dark aura diminishes greatly, which makes Dylan realize he must be really afraid of that whistle, making her sigh in relief, almost thinking she was going to die. Really not wanting to use that strange whistle against Karis again, she asks what's wrong. But he remains silent, still staring at her with a strange expression and not responding. The protagonist notices that he was certainly holding back after seeing the whistle, probably trying not to tear her apart, until he says it was noisy, which catches her off guard and confuses her. And Karis says it was too noisy, so he couldn't sleep, hearing voices, footsteps, and breathing. Thus, Dylan finally understands what he was trying to say. Not expecting his complaint to be so direct, she smiles and apologizes because she got excited praising that bed, which was impressive, as Dylan's room was on the other side of the mansion, far from Karis' room. So, she asks if he could really hear her footsteps and breathing from that distance, and he agrees as they were too loud. This makes her recall Roven's previous explanation about the experiments, shocking her with how sensitive he was, probably because his training wasn't typical. Dylan realizes that even sending him back to his room to sleep would probably result in him not being able to sleep. Given the way Karis was staring at her, it was obvious she couldn't do that at all. And she sits on the bed, agreeing that she couldn't sleep like this either, suggesting that they could just talk to relax and get sleepy again. She asks him to sit as she would make some tea, still receiving that deadly stare from Karis. But he follows her orders when the protagonist gets up and drags a chair for him to sit. When he sits, Dylan notices that he could sit very upright, practically with perfect posture. Dylan comments that she made tea earlier, but now it was cold, so she would need to go to the kitchen to heat it up. But she quickly lost the desire when she looked up at Karis, so he shouldn't be surprised if he drinks and feels it's not that tasty. When she opens it for him to see, the drink immediately catches Karis' attention. He asks if she is some kind of warrior priest, and she denies being anything like that while she heats the tea with her powers. Priests are essentially classified into different types, where a common priest applies for a position and goes through theological education, while a natural priest is born with a divine power and is recruited to become one. Lastly, there is the warrior priest, who possesses unique divine abilities and is sent to the battlefield. Normally, divine power manifests as healing abilities, but occasionally it can manifest as telekinesis or firepower. A priest who shows such powers becomes a warrior priest and is sent to the front lines without exception. Their abilities range from shooting cannonballs to arrows faster, but they gain popularity and are promoted more quickly. However, Dylan didn't want to die so early, so she kept her abilities a secret despite revealing them to Karis now. She didn't think he would tell anyone, but sharing a secret was often the quickest way to create a bond. Suddenly, the guy simply drinks all the tea in one go, which scares the protagonist, making her scream for him to wait a moment. Then she stands up, asking if he is okay. After all, she had just boiled the tea, and he drank it like it was normal water. Dylan says he would feel more relaxed when it's warmer and asks him to drink slowly this time, one sip at a time to appreciate the aroma. So, she fills the cup again and offers it to Karis to drink, watching the beverage in silence. Before, Dylan was a common priest when her divine power suddenly manifested, but this only meant she would have to work even harder. She doubted her life would improve if she revealed some of her crazy powers. She just had to look at Karis, who went through all that training and risked his life to contribute to the war only to end up like that, with a sexy body. The thought even embarrassed Dylan, and she slaps her face to stop thinking foolishly, leaving Karis puzzled. Then she explains that it was nothing because she was lost in thought as they were in the dark, so she decides to light the candle on the table, which makes him grumble and cover his face with his hand. And Dylan realizes she shouldn't have lit the candle when his eyes were so sensitive. And she asks slowly if she should extinguish the candle while Karis drinks the tea much more calmly than before. When he remains silent, Dylan notices he seems more relaxed now and feels relieved when Karis confirms he feels better. The protagonist asks if he could hear other sounds besides her voice now, and he says there are 3 birds waking up outside the window moving between branches, 5 rats, guards at the main gate changing shifts, and several others, impressing Dylan. Karis reveals that he trained his hearing, which makes Dylan incredulous. As if it were her, she would surely go crazy hearing so many things. That must be why Karis became as crazy as he is now, even if he didn't realize it. This makes her consider if he would return to normal if his ears were covered, and she looks at her own hands before approaching Karis, which immediately makes him stare at her with that threatening fury. And Dialin steps back right away, wondering what she was thinking acting like that, probably so tired that she lost her mind. Still, she says it must be very stressful and suggests that she could help him, which didn't excite Karis that much, although the protagonist imagines there must be a better way to do it. She then asks what he does to pass the time, and he responds that it's training and sleeping, doing the basics. The conversation lasts so long that the day dawns, and Dialin hasn't slept a bit even after everything. Last night, Karis calmed down after they talked, so she strengthened him with divine power and sent him back to bed. At least he should have slept well, also the protagonist hoped because he didn't come back. In contrast, Dialin was exhausted from the bad sleep, looking like a zombie. How could she do that knowing Karis could hear every breath she took, which was strangely terrifying? Dialin grabs her hair, frustrated because first she was worried about being poisoned, and now she had to be careful not to lose her life by breathing too loudly during sleep. This makes her cover her mouth, considering that if he couldn't sleep, he might go crazy hearing this sound and run to her room. This makes her get out of bed, thinking she should at least prepare her breakfast very quietly. Suddenly someone shouts that the place is huge. Looking out the window, Dialin notices two people walking and realizes they are the food ingredient delivery men, making her worried they weren't told to be quiet. The men comment that a sick lady or an illegitimate child lives there, and probably there's no work to be done there, and Dialin even feels like shouting at them to shut up. But she can't do that, so she wonders what she should do, her face contorting in worry. After all, Karis was already up in a tree with that murderous aura, ready to jump on the two delivery men. One of them notices an animal growling somewhere and looks up, just as Karis appears, jumping on him, ready to attack. Those two men were the heads of their families and also worked as grocery delivery men. Ignoring what their employer said, the two happily walk as usual through the mansion's garden, talking loudly as if it were the most normal thing in the world. What would happen to these delivery men? It was obvious that if they followed Rovin's advice, they would survive, otherwise, they would be just two more corpses to clean up. But his dark expression clearly indicated that if they didn't handle the work quietly, they needed to be silenced by any means. Now, the unfortunate fate of the disposable workers, a dark shadow loomed over their faces as they saw their end. Then Dialin screamed for Karis to stop right now instead of jumping on them. And the protagonist herself jumped out of the window towards them, wanting to stop the chaos immediately. Surprising herself with her own action, she wonders why she jumped out of the window like that. After all, she could have just blown the whistle from her room, but even Karis was shocked to see Dialin flying in his direction. When this thought crossed her mind, it was too late, but at the same time, Karis himself ran to catch Dialin before she hurt herself on the ground. By this point, even Karis fell to the ground after catching the protagonist who fell from that height, knocking over the food. The delivery men are super worried, asking if Dialin is okay and where that other man suddenly came from. This makes her sit up and shout at the idiot delivery men who didn't hear the precautions for entering that mansion, and she orders them to run away quietly now. One of the delivery men says they were there to drop off the boxes and that it was their job. But the protagonist continues angrily shouting for them to leave once and for all, unless they want to die right there under Karis' murderous aura. The two delivery men freeze in terror on the spot after realizing what exactly they got themselves into. Then they run off after thanking her for the warning, valuing the life Dialin just saved for them. In the end, Dialin and Karis remain sitting in the garden after all that chaos, and she sighs, relieved they listened and left so quickly. Still, shortly after, she looks at Karis in shock, remembering that the mad dog was still right next to her. She hopes that maybe he had managed to regain sanity when Dialin fell, and nervously thanks Karis for saving her life. But he was still trembling like a beast, and she realizes it must have been a reflex because something was falling. When Karis stands up with that murderous aura, Dialin holds him, asking him to wait and leave the delivery men alone. But he doesn't even move with her little strength, making her consider using the whistle now until something catches her attention. Realizing something was wrong, as Karis seemed to be feeling anxious, this makes the protagonist release him and try calling his name, saying it's okay after all, those men only came to deliver the groceries and nothing more. They weren't in danger, so Dylan says it's okay now that they've left. The protagonist notices Kara's calming down, so she could just talk to him about this kind of thing, then suggests they go back to the room to rest. Come to think of it, Karis was just a man with keen senses, plus he spent too much time on the battlefield and had to deal with poisoned food. Dylan touches his arm, imagining it's no surprise he perceives all unknown stimuli as a threat. Karis would be dead if he hadn't reacted when he was anxious. That was the kind of life he led until now. Dylan's job was to teach him to live beyond the battlefield, to treat him as a human so he could become one. So, the protagonist praises him for holding back, insisting they go inside to finish treating his scars, accompanying Karis back into the mansion. She smiles, relieved to have resolved the situation with her quick thinking and to have acted with such intuition. Upon entering, they find the two guards who were sleeping starting to wake up after having slept on the job. And Dylan calls to them, quickly grabbing their attention, giving a fake smile as she mocks that they must have slept well, forcing them to apologize after she tells them what just happened. After all, they weren't even there to do anything. Returning to the room, the protagonist asks Karis to lie down on the bed and points to it, which only makes Karis stare at her like a dog after receiving new orders, taking a long moment to understand what he just heard, and even Dylan is puzzled by his slow reaction. So she herself grabs his arm to guide him to the bed, walking slowly through the room. With that, Dylan smiles as she successfully makes him lie down, placing her hands on her hips with pure pride. Dylan says she will take care of his back that day and asks Karis to lie on his stomach, seeming to give orders when she combines her hands with words. Soon he grumbles that it's uncomfortable and she doesn't understand for a moment what the problem is. Before apologizing and helping him turn his face to the side on the pillow to make him more comfortable, he still complains about being uncomfortable, leaving Dylan puzzled again, and after a moment, he reveals that the floor is more comfortable. The protagonist understands that he must not be used to such a soft bed, but insists he will feel more comfortable once he gets used to it, insisting that it's not a battlefield, so he doesn't need to be tense all the time, and feeling his body relax is a good thing. It means being comfortable. Dylan says this should be his normal state from now on, which makes Karis remain silent. Now that she thought about it, it seemed Karis didn't respond unless she gave it as an order, another thing she should correct in his behavior. She raises her eyes, wondering what it means to be a kind noble. All the nobles she saw were bad and despicable people in that world, which didn't bring good memories. But at least she knew she shouldn't turn him into someone like that. They should want Karis to become a kind knight that girls would dream about. Still, it seemed there was a long way to go. Her train of thought makes Karis close his eyes to rest. So, Dylan sits on the bed and uses her hand to use her powers on his back to heal him, saying it would take time for them to get used to it so he could sleep in a bed little by little. A little later, she is impressed because he managed to sleep deeply on the bed. Then, she prepares because it's time to make food for that muscular guy, but this time a decent dish. Looking at the recipe on the table with the ingredients at her disposal, the protagonist feels Karis' presence behind her. Then, she looks at him with a smile ready to start, although she didn't expect him to wake up right at noon. But she brought him there to make sure there was no poison in the ingredients, especially since Karis seemed in a good mood after a morning nap and treatment. Dylan feels a bit guilty for using him as a detector dog, but she was doing what she could to survive. She holds some vegetables and says all he needs to do is check if there is any poison in the ingredients. After smelling the two, Karis assures her there was no poison in them, which makes her satisfied that they are both fine. Then she checks the recipe to see what else she should do since the guards brought several boxes, so there are many things to use. Luckily for her, Rovan brought an entire box full of cookbooks, which made her excited. The protagonist starts to look through the books to find out what else there was. Then she simply closes the book in a matter of seconds, muttering that she couldn't understand anything and wonders if cooking was part of some alien culture, which was very strange when she knew how to read and write well. Then offers Karis to look at her cookbook, not seeming very enthusiastic about it. He stares at the book, which makes her realize he must be focused, maybe even interested in the reading. She asks with a smile if he was curious and would like to look inside, opening the book for Karis to see. But he just says there was no poison, which makes her realize he was just doing his job instead of showing interest. So the protagonist says it's a relief there's no poison, offering the book for Karis to look at. which makes Karis turn the book around in all directions, not understanding anything. Worrying Dialin because he didn't know how to read, having gone through long training without being taught that, and Karis says it's not necessary for battle. She is shocked, wondering how they could raise children that way, and who thought it was a good idea, especially curious about who is behind it. Dialin would need to teach him to read as well, confusing Karis again. She suggests it would be a good learning experience, asking if it wouldn't interest him, making them stare at each other in silence. Worrying her because although he wasn't angry, it seemed like he was really thinking about her question. Probably, Karis just needed to answer yes or no, and he might even know what he liked or disliked. So apparently, she also needed to teach preferences, besides reading and sleeping in a bed, which was basic for nobles. But Karis couldn't become a noble if he's starved to death, so she decides to hurry and cook first, looking back at the food. Dialin reads that they should first cut the onions and carrots into small pieces, so she asks if Karis understands what that means. When he agrees, the protagonist realizes it should make sense since he knew how to cut people. Asking if he would like to try cutting the vegetables, he stares at the knife before grabbing it with his hand, with that same murderous aura that makes Dialin shiver in fear to the point of screaming. After all, she completely forgot that he used to be a human weapon, which worried her even after saying this wasn't a battlefield. She decides to keep her distance, preparing to run if necessary. After all, above the vegetables, her life always came first. Even the vegetables were crying in fear, full of terror. From the not-so-omniscient point of view of the vegetables, it seemed like Karis would destroy them. But instead, he cuts them all with great skill, to the point of impressing Dialin, feeling like she was glimpsing a technology that hadn't even emerged in that world, a kind of future of human civilization. In the end, cutting into small pieces wasn't something a common human could do. Finally, Karis says he's done, catching Dialin off guard in her thoughts. She praises him for his good work, as it was an impressive performance, and approaches to see the results. In the end, he only created a huge, disgusting mush on the table after cutting, leaving the protagonist in shock. It seemed he cut them into pieces that were too small, making her wonder where his cutting skills were usually used before this. Karis tries to reflect before saying it was in captivity, torture, and enemy bodies, melting Dialin's mind completely after hearing those bizarre things so naturally, making her fold her hands, praying for the onion and carrot to rest in peace in the vegetable heaven. She couldn't ask for much, just deciding to focus on feeding him and not worrying about anything else. So, she just decides to check the rest of the recipe, seeing that they should cut the meat and add oil to the pan. She just needed to survive that day, and she prays for everything to go well, telling Karis he should cut the meat into cubes. He finishes successfully, which makes Dialin praise him again, moving on to the next step of the flour. Later, the two stare at the result of their efforts with great brightness, because this time the smell was delicious and seemed worthy of a well-made recipe inside the pot, which makes the protagonist very happy, not knowing something could smell so good. It was all because Karis helped her. Dialin didn't know that cooking required so much agility, stamina, and physical strength. The protagonist asks Karis how he felt cooking, and he says it was low in difficulty. She insists, explaining she wants to know if it was fun, which doesn't make him understand the question much better. Dialin tries to think of a way to explain what fun is. After all, deep down Karis only did it because he needed to. So she asks if he would like to do it again, and he asks back if he has to do it again, which makes her agree that only if it's his will, not needing to if he doesn't want to. When Karis reflects, Dialin says there's no need to force himself to do it, they could always discover this together. She smiles, saying that this way he could improve with practice in the kitchen, but he interrupts her, agreeing that he wants to do it again. Still, Dialin thinks he was indeed a traitor for having eaten the horrendous thing she made the previous day. Saying she looks forward to the next meal after all, she doubted he had expressed his preference, but she couldn't help feeling disappointed. In any case, the protagonist thanks him for cooking and says she will set the table, asking him to bring the stew. In the end, the stew was tasty despite the slight bitter flavor, and Karis' socialization training began to progress very slowly. But there was still an issue they couldn't resolve, even after learning to communicate. Dialin asks if he likes carrots, and Karis agrees, as well as spinach, despite not liking the bed. And while they sit together in the room, she asks what he thinks of her, without hesitation, which makes Karis promptly respond that he doesn't like her, leaving the protagonist frustrated. It seemed desperate how he could answer so quickly without hesitation. After all, even dogs show love to those who take care of them, unlike Karis, who was insensitive. The protagonist asks why he doesn't like her, and he says she's noisy. This catches her off guard, understanding that it's no wonder he thinks that about her. Since that day, she came close to death several times in her sleep because she snored and ground her teeth every night. But it wasn't like Dialin could stop when she felt so tired. It was a natural reaction of her body. She insists to Karis that she hadn't snored or ground her teeth that much recently, despite him still calling her noisy. Karis learns quickly what he wants to be taught, but Dialin still hasn't figured out what to do about his sharp senses. He seemed more than ready to make his debut in high society, judging only by the way he cut his steak during meals. However, just because he learned to tolerate the noises doesn't mean all of this still doesn't bother him. It seemed impossible for him to handle balls and music. The protagonist asks how her breathing could bother him. After all, she wasn't an enemy and didn't walk around with a knife, and Karis insists that she is too noisy. His silent responses suggested that she should just die soon if breathing was what kept her alive, truly worrying her. Dialin asks about cats and if he dislikes them too, but apparently, Karis hates all kinds of imaginable animals. Deep down, he seemed to hate all kinds of existing life, a question that makes Karis silent to think, until he finally agrees that he doesn't like them, leading the protagonist to sigh deeply in disappointment. But if he didn't like anything, then there was nothing to be done, covering her nose to simply stop breathing from now on, thinking he should just wait, because someday he would openly say he likes her. The day continues to pass, and Karis shifts his attention outside the window to the sunlight coming through the glass. Keeping silent after all that conversation, reflecting to himself. With his left hand, he holds a piece of a leaf next to his bed, and the protagonist says that it was a leaf that came from outside with the wind. The breeze continues to blow her hair, and Dialin asks if he doesn't intend to fight with a leaf. Karis watches Dialin in silence, still feeling the wind blowing his clothes and hair strands. And she asks if he remembers what to do to calm down when necessary, although his mind is just thinking about that leaf, which makes her praise him because he was calming down more quickly now, being a good boy. Karis thinks that this woman was always making noise, whether moving or sleeping deeply. But when he was next to Dialin, he was feeling something he had never felt before. It was different from the forced feeling of peace he used to feel with drugs and spells on the battlefield. It was nothing like having all his senses removed and being thrown into an endless void with nothing but bodies and blood in his field of vision. With no need to get rid of those noises, now he understood they didn't threaten him in any way. He watches the birds landing outside the window under the summer wind, making him stare at the bird that landed there after he raised his head towards it. It was a feeling of pure peace that arose in his chest. Karis reveals that he liked that. But the protagonist didn't understand his line of reasoning and gets angry, making it a long time since she remained sitting without making noise, to the point where her legs were starting to go numb in that position. Dialin wonders why she sat like that on her knees in the first place. She thought that if she served as a maid, she would act more like a noble. That way she would get used to giving orders and being treated with respect. Still, Dialin didn't know why she had to submit to this as a maid. Noble society was full of hierarchies, and technically she was still the daughter of a baron. Besides, Karis wasn't even a member of the nobility yet, which only made her angrier for having to act like that, making her throw her accessories on the floor. Now, she continues with her legs trembling from sitting in the same position, and she discreetly changes the pose of her legs. And she starts to tell that she technically came from a noble family, catching Karis by surprise, not understanding where her line of reasoning was going. Until Dialin raises her eyes to look at him with irritation, saying she has no reason to be formal with him. Karis just agrees that it makes sense without hesitation. Catching the protagonist by surprise with his direct answer, Dialin asks if it was really okay and if he truly didn't mind, mentioning that his expression made it obvious and wondering why she was asking all this again. Thus, the protagonist asserts that she will continue being informal from now on, gesturing with her arms. Soon, the two just stare at each other in that strange and awkward silence, which makes her think it seemed much weirder than she initially imagined, giving a nervous smile when she didn't even know what to say now. Besides, how should she refer to him now? She would probably need to stop calling him Mr. Karis, much less as young master or something similar. After thinking for some time, Dialin decides that just Karis should be enough. and she nervously touches her own neck in agreement, opening a big smile and pointing to Kara's face as she calls him by his name, which makes Kara's show an expression that was a mix of disgust and disbelief, not looking happy at all. Leaving Dylan puzzled, his reaction was far from expected. Even after he agreed with her being informal, deep down it seemed that Kara's didn't accept it very well. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.